Good morning. This is day 2 of our conference. Thank you everyone for being here. Again, I would like to thank Ilia State University for partnering with us for hosting this conference. We're continuing the conversation about the Black Sea region, and today we have 2 more panel discussions. Let me quickly introduce the moderator of our panel 1 today. Ambassador Vasil Dato Sikharulidze is a senior fellow at FPRI in our Eurasia program, former Georgian ambassador to the United States, former Georgian Minister of Defense, with a very long bio, which is available in the agenda and on our website, so I invite you to check it out. But Dato will now introduce our panel 1, which is going to be focused on security, strategic connectivity, resilience, but particularly resilience. So, Dato, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Maya. Good morning, everybody. And we are starting our day 2, half day. So I'm acting under very strict directions to follow and to be strictly on a schedule, because we have to leave for Katia on time. So we have a very interesting panel this morning. We are talking about the war, but about the war with the different means, non-military means. And we will be speaking about information, disinformation, using propaganda and subversion to achieve its strategic objectives. And also yet another very important weapon of war that become very effective lately in hands of Putin and Putin's government: corruption. Corruption that strengthens his power internally in Russia and his influence outside. So we will be talking about these components of the hybrid war, and we have excellent panel gathered this morning here to talk about these issues. We have Katia Glod from Russia West Policy Fellow from European Leadership Network, and she's also a non-resident fellow from SIPA, very distinguished Washington-based institution. We have Otto Tabuns, founding director, Baltic Security Foundation. It's a special pleasure to have representative from Baltic. In my student years, we were looking at Baltic freedom movement as an exemplary movement, so I hope, and they are doing excellently in fighting disinformation and against weaponization of corruption. We have Sergej Sumlenny, a founder and managing director of European Resilience Initiative Center. We have, and last but not least, and we are special thanks to Asha. She just arrived after a long flight, and it's, I understand that it's a very courageous step to come directly from the flight, from the airport to the panel. Thank you, Asha. Asha Castleberry-Hernandez, former senior advisor of Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs of the U.S. State Department. So, without further delay, I'd like to ask Katia to start our panel, and I'd also would like to ask our panelists to keep 5, maximum 6 minutes in their presentation, and then we will have enough time for Q&A sessions.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Dato, thank you very much. Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Dato and Foreign Policy Research Institute, it's a great pleasure to be here in Tbilisi, in Georgia, and talking about the Black Sea security and the countries that fall within this region. So I will talk briefly about subversion. I don't know so much about Black Sea security. That's not exactly my expertise. I mostly focus on Eastern Europe, Belarus, Russia, Ukraine. So I will try to draw some general conclusions and maybe offer a couple of examples based on Belarus. Well, basically, so what is, when we talk about strengthening the resilience of regional states to subversion, what do we understand by Russian subversion? I will probably use the definition of Russia's efforts intended to influence the domestic politics of other countries and undermines their institutions. Russia does it, it has always done it. If we look back at the Soviet Union, and its policy towards its satellite states, it existed back then, and it has carried it through into its more modern history. And Russia uses, obviously, to achieve its multiple foreign policy interests at relatively low cost, such as like preservation of the regime, recognition of Russia as a great power, and maintaining influence in the region, which is particularly, I think, relevant to the Eastern European post-Soviet countries. And particularly, I think, as far as the former Soviet countries are concerned, and sorry for using this term, I know it's outdated and old-fashioned, but I don't think we have come up with a new term. I think the Russian toolbox is particularly wide, and it ranges from, subvert military operations to economic coercion and economic subversion. Obviously, these tools are much, more effective in these so-called near broads than they would be in more Western countries. When specialist experts talk about deterrence to Russian subversion, deterrence of Russian subversion, I think they suggest three most effective ways to deal with it. Well, first of all, is to focus on most vulnerable regions and institutions. Second, to link punishment to specific Russian actions. And the third point is to focus specifically on so-called denied or covert subversion, because it can be particularly harmful as, populations, public in those countries don't notice it immediately, and therefore let it go kind of unabated. Well, what kind of means does Russia use for its subversion? Well, if we talk about military subversion, it will be, all very well known to you groups, I'm sure, like GRU, Foreign Military Intelligence of the General Staff of the Armed Forces, VDV, so-called Airborne Spetsnaz, Special Operation Forces, private military companies, Wagner Group, which has been much in the news, also a very good example, when, Little Green Man all of a sudden appeared in Donbass in 2014. If we talk about political subversion, I think it will be more kind of, a bit broader actions executed by different intelligence services. Again, GRU, FSB, SVR, this is, also the Foreign Intelligence Service. Various state-linked patriotic groups like the Russian Orthodox Church, the so-called Night Valves, bikers, etc. And I mean, examples about trying to influence pro-Russian agenda in the countries, trying, for example, to support the regimes, as it has been the case in Belarus or in Ukraine, for example, with President Yanukovych. Again, if we look at economic subversion, it will be using state-owned companies, mostly in the energy field, like Gazprom, Rosneft, and private, like Lukoil, etc. And of course, information subversion is very important, because I think it's particularly linked, it's enshrined within Russian doctrine to use disinformation as its foreign agency tool. And again, Russian channels, media channels are very effective in this, RT, Sputnik, troll farms like Internet Research Agency and similar. And the last type of subversion is cyber, and again is executed by the same state organizations, GRU, FSB, but also there are more independent hackers like APT 2829, which also makes it very hard to attribute and pinpoint the exact perpetrator. As far as deterrence is concerned, again, experts talk about two types of deterrence: deterrence by denial and deterrence by punishment. Deterrence by denial is something I will speak, I will say a couple of more words because it's considered to be a bit more effective, as it involves actions that make Russian subversion less likely to succeed or more expensive or challenging to undertake. So in practice, it basically relates to policies that states can take to improve their direct defense, to improve their cyber defense, reducing dependence on Russian energy, strengthening border security, providing media literacy training, improving the rule of law. As far as deterrence by punishment is concerned, it sadly, again, research shows that it has been less effective because mainly we can talk about two tools. I'm sure there are other methods, but the most, I think, well-known are economic and diplomatic sanctions. And it's been hard to implement them. I think particularly with economic sanctions, we are also seeing in the case of Russia how difficult it is proving to have an effect. It's also, long-term accumulated effect. It does not kind of yield immediate benefit. And again, with the case of Russia during the war, it has been very clear how basically limited this tool is. And the effects that were expected, for example, to have on the Russian economy, they were not there. The Russian economy is still doing better than expected. And only with the direct energy sanctions, like the cap price on Russian oil, is now seen to be as having some effect. But again, this is just, it's still very limited. And also, if we talk about regional states like Georgia, Black Sea states, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, it's also very hard for these states to implement because, all these states have a relationship with Russia, so they cannot really impose economic sanctions. And diplomatic sanctions, they're even less effective. I mean, you can, basically ban a bunch of bad, nasty officials to travel abroad, but so what? I mean, they still, they can stay in Russia, they can enjoy other benefits without traveling to Europe or to the United States. If we talk, so I said that I will focus a bit more about the deterrence by denial and by resilience. As I am running out of time, I would like just to mention two things. I think in deterrence by denial, resilience, it's very important to focus on institutions and the resilience of societies. And particularly, I think civil society is a key piece of this resilient puzzle. And in the countries of Eastern Europe, former Soviet countries, where weak and ineffective institutions still prevail, I think civil society, it's really something that drives change, drives innovation. Civil society is more agile. It also represents a diversity of views. It's easier to include it, different points of view, and to make it more effective. And when we talk about making civil society in regional states more resilient, I think several aspects are very important, and I'm finishing off, Dato, I'm promising these are my last points. Well, first of all, it's to enhance civil society and state cooperation, because civil society can exactly see better and can basically pinpoint, open the government eyes to those gaps which exist in a government approach. And it would be, for example, useful maybe to establish various, special task forces for the governments with representatives of civil society, business, in order to design effective approaches to information security, cyber safety, education, media literacy. Also to include minorities, so that, diversity can be, as I said earlier, can be included. The second point, I think, is very important to focus on the media sector. And here, I think, in particular, media reform and building of state capacity for independent media are important, to make media, to help media produce high-quality content and also target disinformation. and obviously, yes, as I said, to counter the Russian propaganda. And something also which I think has been particularly underlined in the recent years is so-called cognitive resilience. And this is, to build citizens' critical thinking, especially in terms of building awareness about Russia's disinformation and understanding the real intention behind such Russia's soft power projects. And again, here there have been many projects in various countries of various educational courses in schools that teachers get together, design courses and share them. And I'll probably stop here, and we'll be happy then to go into more details in the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you, Katia. And now I'd like to ask Otto to give us his presentation.
Thank you very much. As I probably indicated yesterday, I'm very glad to be back in Georgia, and I'm very glad to be in Caucasus because I think what has always been there has been the solidarity between our two regions because unfortunately we understand too well in how interesting of a neighborhood we are. And if I was a Tamada right now, then certainly having neighbors like we have is something that we would not like to wish to most other nations in the world. But so for that purpose we are here, and for that purpose we also have this, I think, fascinating topic of conversation. Let me begin by outlining some of the examples and elements of how destabilization, subversion, disinformation, and other of those perhaps more asymmetrical tools have been observed in my country, Latvia, and in the Baltic region. Let me start with the fact that, of course, the first way how destabilization was achieved was, of course, by conventional and military means. That was, of course, the Soviet occupation and, of course, the reservations of the Russian government of actually taking the Soviet and the Russian soldiers out. So even though we regained our independence in 91, we still had Russian soldiers up until 98. So most of them left by 94, but we did have Russian radar station that they wanted to leave there, and of course used many different means. And of course here we can be very thankful to the American pressure that we were able to get rid of that, and then under the tune of specially composed music have that radar station demolished on live television. So it was such a show, and I remember that as a kid. But of course once the Russian army left, that was not the end of attempts to destabilize and subvert the democracy that we have regained. There were two aspects. One of that was the way how the Russian government wanted actually to put back that contingent. Just recently information was published that in 98 there were some protests in central Riga that were staged by the Russian government at the time when also most of the major Russian television stations happened to have a business trip to Riga, and it was used as an excuse by the Russian President Yeltsin to suggest to the German foreign minister that perhaps there is a need of a humanitarian mission in the Baltic states, and let us roll our tanks back again just to make sure that there is no conflict between the communities and we would not have the violence that perhaps we have seen in the Caucasus region. Thank goodness the German foreign ministry reacted quite reasonably and did not agree to that, but they did rely that information. And so I think we did have expectations about the ways how Russia could develop after 91, but I think with different ways of governance, there has always this issue of what is their national interest in their mind and what are some of the things that did not change, even with the fact that the Soviet Union, which had also occupied Latvia, was going down. Another aspect was, of course, trying to retain the veteran networks. Even though there was no army present there, they tried to keep up the connections that they had with people who fought in Afghanistan, people who served together, and they have been trying to use that ever since. Even if we would look at being a lawyer by training, it's always interesting to look at some of the cases that have recently been in the courts. And it is interesting to know that in many of the cases where people have been implicated for spying, there has been this connection of serving together in the Soviet army or being connected in one or another way, which the Russian services try to use even 30 years after the service. So that was also a vulnerability that they are still trying to use. I wanted also to mention the public role of Russian language. And do not get me wrong, I do not think that I'm backward, because we understand very well the importance of minority rights, and I would think that in all of our history, Latvia has had a better record on that than Russia has ever had. But an important aspect here is how the Russian language was weaponized to make sure that people would follow the information that is prepared in Moscow, and there would not really be many alternatives to the information space that is provided. Something that is used also now, especially with that generation which received education under the Soviet occupation, where it was limited between the Latvian and Russian languages. And so if your main foreign language is Russian, then certainly it is an issue of how easy it is for you to get information that has not been affected by the Kremlin in one way or another. Another aspect is also the Orthodox religion, and I would like to underline that in the case of Latvia, it is perhaps rather the religion than not the church, because the Latvian Orthodox Church is autonomous, and even though we have observed influence operations in that regard, it is not that the Latvian Orthodox Church would operate as an arm of the Russian government, similarly as we would be able to argue is the case within Russia. It is also interesting to know that, returning a little bit to this aspect of minority rights, one other aspect is that it is also with regard to the religion part, you would have different factions, and one of the factions in the Russian Orthodox Church is the Old Believers, who I believe it was the 18th century. Most of them found refuge in Latvia, actually, because after the reforms they had in Russia that quite a few of the believers did not approve of, only way for them to stay alive was to actually migrate to Latvia, which is the key reason why I think we have the biggest Russian old believer community in the world, because it was possible for them to be respected more in our country than they were in the country of their origin. Then I, of course, have to mention the links of the Communist Party, and the people who were officials are associated with this group, and of course the aspect of economic leverage and cross-border business, such as in the terms of natural gas, which Latvia used to be 100% dependent on, as well as such industries as the food industry, and the aspect of more developed technologies that we have that Russia has found out how to try to subvert. For example, if we talk about electronic public services and the ways how Russia has been using cyber attacks to try to compromise these. With regard to weaponization of corruption, it is certainly widely used in the Baltic case. And there's also quite literal a way how it was used, remembering the Soviet officers who sold off their weapons in the early 90s to what later became the organized crime. It started with the inefficiencies of the Soviet and then the Russian military that we can also see now today in the war in Ukraine. But it was amazing now to think how we actually got such an extensive organized crime crime in the Baltics in the 90s, because during the occupation, private citizens were not freely allowed to have guns, and so where did all the organized crime get their weapons from? So that was the Soviet officers who sold them off in the 90s, and that was one of these examples. But of course, if we talk more closer to what is the academical definition of this term, then certainly I think it was quite valuable that we, as a country which had regained independence and were in the period of transition of putting everything in order, I think for many in Russia it was not a problem that we were slow in this matter, and they tried to avoid this institutionalization of efforts to fight corruption, where we also had help from the West because it was a precondition for our Western integration. I think that I also have to mention the fact that this aspect, the Western integration, the collective security arrangement, was probably one of the key reasons why we were able to deal with the weaponization of corruption, with different matters of destabilization. At the same time, as our conventional security increased, the asymmetrical ways how it was challenged increased as well. Understanding that for Russia it could be difficult to challenge us militarily or directly, so why not try to use some other ways how to do it. And I think it underlines the fact that democracy is important and it does matter. It has been the case in Latvia for more than a century now. But I think it is important to understand that it also does matter for Russia because of the ways how it is sometimes possible to abuse the weaknesses of democracy, abuse the openness of this form of the government in contrast of what they have in Russia, because I think as they increasingly understand, subverting democracy is cheaper than war, and of course that is the way how they try to do that in the case of the Baltic states, where the collective security arrangement that we had was probably the key reason why we were actually more fortunate than Georgia and Ukraine, what helped us from direct confrontation with Russia because of how the history happened and how it was possible for the Baltic states to join the alliance, but still it has not prevented us from other ways how we have this influence.
Thank you, Otto. And I remember that how this terrible propaganda from very early stages when you were trying to become EU and NATO member, that how terribly we are treating Russian population. Regardless of your treatment, that there were so many Russians trying to attain your citizenship. So I remember that propaganda and how terrible that was. All right, thank you. And now I'd like to ask Sergej to join us. Okay. Start his presentation.
Thank you so much. First of all, yes, thank you for this honor, this privilege being here in Tbilisi, in Georgia, and speaking here in front of this audience and with distinguished experts. It's a great honor. Thank you. So I was posted to Ukraine for 6 years between 2015 and 2021, and after that I came back to Germany, where I run my think tank, European Resilience Initiative Center, and that makes for me very natural to talk about the Russian subversion tactics and Russian weaponization of everything in the context of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the attempts of Russia to undermine the Western unity using Russian networks in Germany in particular. So we know that especially early this full-scale invasion, Germany was ein Problemkind, problem child of the West, effectively sabotaging, not only denying Ukraine the delivery of lethal weapons, but also sabotaging actively such deliveries from other nations. We think about the delivery of Soviet-era produced howitzers from Finland to Ukraine, the fact that these howitzers came to Finland out of German arsenals where they landed during the GDR, the East Germany times, provided Germany with a veto right for re-export, what Germany actively used, and banned Finland of supplying Ukraine early this war with vital weapons. I also remember how Germany tried to send to Ukraine manpads, Soviet-era produced Strela manpads, which were kept on warehouses for 30 years. And as internal German armies investigation revealed, 30% of these manpads were not functional. So what comes next? So they could not be fired because they were kept in that bad conditions. What came next? Next there came a leak from the Federal Chancellor's office accusing Estonia in earning money on delivering old Soviet weapons to Ukraine, saying literally that Estonia is trying to get richer on the EU funds, this system when you send your older weapons to Ukraine and you get money to buy new weapons. So the leak from the Federal Chancellor office in Germany said that Estonia delivered to Ukraine all the Soviet manpads, and in exchange it purchased modern Western Stinger manpads. The interesting point was it was not Estonia which tried to deliver Strela, but Germany, and Estonia never had these US-produced Stingers, never bought them with this money fund. So it was a deliberately leaked information to whitewash the German image and to accuse a NATO partner which demonstrated fundamental, adamant, strong support for Ukraine, which says a lot about the problems early this war between Germany and other NATO countries, and the discussion around the support of Ukraine. So after pointing out that there was a problem early this war, I want to come further to Russian subversion tactics in Germany, how Russia tried to instrumentalize the German political elites and use them in favor of its war of aggression. So first, when we talk about corruption, when I first heard what distinguished moderator said about we want to speak about corruption, how corruption influence and destabilize the region, I'm sorry for that reflexive action, but I immediately said, oh wait, because, and then I heard what you said, that how Russian corruption instrumentalized it, but my reflexive reaction was, oh, not again, please tell him that Ukraine is corrupt and cannot be supported therefore. Because the corruption talk which we used to hear in Germany was mostly the talk about how corrupt and failed state Ukraine is and how Ukraine may not be supported because any weapon we deliver to Ukraine will land in wrong hands and any support is useless. That is what we heard also from the Amnesty International when they tried to spread the narrative that US delivered Javelin anti-tank guided missiles land in the hand of terrorists, etc. That is what Germany constantly repeated from some political circles, that any economic or military support for Ukraine is useless because you cannot support a failed state. Which was, of course, wrong. It was also talk about the alleged accusation that Ukraine may not be accepted into NATO because of the corruption, etc. From another hand, we know that it is our German Federal Chancellor who used to serve for Gazprom. It is also Austrian Foreign Minister who is on board of Rosneft. It is French Foreign Minister who used to work for Russian energy corporations, not a Ukrainian one. But when we talk about corruption, how Russia corrupted our political elites, corruption is not only about bribes. Bribe is the lowest, most simple level of corruption. If we come to the origin of the word corruption in Latin, it is actually distortion, it is twisting. Corruption is twisting of the way how political decisions are being taken, and what objects you try to perceive, taking your political decisions and using your power the people have delegated you, or your company, for example, if we're talking about private sector. And if you have another ideas in your mind when you take your decisions than you should have had, then you're corrupt. And here we can look at mostly at the wrong ideas of how to gain influence, how to present yourself, how to promote yourself. And all these decisions are coming into consideration of the German politicians, many of them, when they take decisions regarding of Russia. Look at the northern region of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. It is the northeastern region which has seashore of Baltic Sea, of the Baltic Sea, and borders to Poland. One of the most poor German regions with the lowest level of migration, with one of the highest level of support for far-right ideas, and which is currently run by a social democratic government in an alliance with the leftist party. And we know that this government of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern was a fierce lobbyist for the Nord Stream 2 project until the full-scale invasion. And the Mr. President of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Manuel Schwesig, said repeatedly that Nord Stream 2 is a poor economic project. When the United States threatened with sanctions against the Nord Stream 2, what did the government of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern do? They have founded a non-profit foundation, Stiftung, non-profit charity, non-profit endowment. It got a name, Environmental Stiftung. And the founding money came from Gazprom. And the only reason was that this Stiftung, in a case when the US sanctioned the Nord Stream 2, that this non-profit environmental support endowment buys equipment, because you cannot sanction this type of endowment, and they buy equipment for Nord Stream 2 and provide it to Nord Stream 2. If you look at all this scheme, I will not go into detail here, but if you look like where the address, where it was registered, who were the founding fathers and mothers of this Stiftung, like where did money came from, this practically was registered in the same building, in the same floor with the Gazprom office. And then we look like further into the region, and you think, okay, what did the Russians do there, and how did they weaponize very simple things? Like, I repeat it, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern is a very poor German region with low level of unemployment, and any job is counted. So we have a town of Wismar on the sea side, and this town of Wismar has, I would say, like 40,000 population. They had like actually two big employers there, a shipyard and a wood processing mill. Both were about to go bankrupt, and shipyards went bankrupt. The government, because they both were economically inefficient, because it was the old Soviet era in entrepreneurship. And the minister president of the region, it was back then not Manuel Schwesig, but Erwin Sellering, they looked desperately for an investor who would ready to buy these non-efficient bankrupt companies. They found one. For the yard, it was a multimillionaire son of a Gazprom board director, Yusupov, a former Ministry of Energy of Russia, who in his early age of like 30 had millions of US dollars because he was a good entrepreneur. And he bought this yard and saved jobs for the region. And for another one, for the wood mill, they have found Ilim Timber, a Russian company which was connected with to Dmitry Medvedev. So this region suddenly has two investments from Russia, which they know have saved an important large city in the region from bankruptcy and from social riots because of mass unemployment. And they know that the moment when Russians got angry, they pull out the plug and they take the investments, and they can make these companies bankrupt again, because the Germans will not find an investor for this type of companies. And they know that they better have good connections with the Russians, because if the city goes bankrupt, the prime minister of the region will not be re-elected, and that will be a problem. And the regions in Germany, they don't have legally rights to go into foreign policy discussion, but the regions are sitting in the upper chamber of the two-chamber, some sort. It's not two-chamber parliament, but for the simple approach, we can name it two-chamber parliament, and the upper chamber can veto any legislation. So, in order to maintain inner peace in a German political system, you need to have good relations with the minister president of the region. And minister president of the region is happy when his region is economically prospering, and his economic prosperity and peace in his region depends on like two small investments from Russia. So Russia buys loyalty of German political elites by absolutely legal, non-criminal investments into bad apples. The same case was when the Russian Kirovsky Zavod tried to buy a bankrupt company in a producer of buses, I think in Thuringia. The same situation came in 2000, that was huge, in 2009, in 2009, as Russian Sberbank, state-owned bank, tried to buy Opel. And if you remember, 2009, there was the case when the global economic crisis came and General Motors had problems, and Opel was a European subsidiary of General Motors with limited rights to sell in their cars. They may not sell the new cars outside of Europe, so they went bankrupt. And then came Sberbank with zero experience of producing cars and said, we have money, we can save your jobs. Like in Rissenheim, 20,000 jobs in other cities. And German Gref, the CEO of Sberbank, visited Frankfurt automobile fair, and he was cheered as the new boss of one of the biggest German car producers. Then the bailout came, and the deal was cancelled in the last moment. But just imagine if Russia would have gained access to one of the biggest German car producers, controlling some dozens of thousands of jobs in Germany, and could blackmail Germany with that. So, I wrap it. So, what does it mean? It means that we have like practically two conclusions. First, in Germany, there is still, despite of all Zeitenwende, there is no understanding that Russia weaponizes everything. Russia weaponizes culture, Russia weaponizes science, Russia weaponizes economy, investment, media, everything. And there is understanding that, there are like hacking activities, there are subversion tactics, but investments are good, and like Anna Netrebko is good, etc. That's a problem. And that has the consequence that the German authorities do not search proactively for what they can do even to fulfill their duties. My last example, and this is really dirty and huge. Because yesterday evening, after we had like this beautiful dinner, I got a call from my colleague in Berlin, and we were cooperating since months on. I support her a bit with advice. Like, it's not we are cooperating. Like, supported her a bit with advice on a legal character, because I have my law master in EU sanctions. And they found out that the Russian subsidiary of Russia Today, of RT, Raptly, this subsidiary of RT which produces video content, which was EU banned in last year, is still operating legally in Berlin. In the center of Berlin, close to Tiergarten, which is some sort of central park in Berlin, in a fancy office. They have just moved from one building to another. They changed like their address, like several buildings. The same CEO, the same web page, the same everything, the same activities. They openly promote in Germany on the German web page ways of cooperating with them. They have German phone numbers. They have everything. They still cooperate. And it is in Europe, it is the obligation of member states, of the EU member states, to implement the sanctions. It is their responsibility. And Germany clearly broke its responsibility, because it is not the first case when an EU sanctions entity continues to operate in Germany. The second case in the same Berlin was last year when the EU sanctioned Россотрудничество, Russia-owned international agency for cooperation, which Russia used for subversive tactics, for spreading of propaganda, of disinformation, still operated their huge multi-story building with huge letters on it, Russian house, in the center of Berlin and Friedrichstrasse. And it operated it without any problem until a former deputy of the German parliament, Volker Beck, came to police and filed a private complaint about it. So this is the problem, and now I wrap it up. We really need to understand that there is still no understanding of how dangerous is Russia and how dirty our Russian tricks are. And the Russians don't need to be genius to subvert Germany. They do it with really simple, straight approach, and they can do it only because they don't face deterrence and they don't face rejection of their tactics. And the case of Russia today proves it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sergej, for a very impressive presentation and bringing up this issue. I'm sure we will come back to this issue during our discussion, and I think that it's one of the most powerful weapons in Putin's hand, using corruption as a weapon of war that merges that business with his personal pleasure. So. Now, last but not, of course, least, Asha, thank you again. I truly appreciate your courage to come here after this long flight. And please, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I definitely appreciate being here. And it's been just such a pleasure. And the timing's great because right about now in Washington, there's a lot going on between the agencies and in Congress as far as just building up a Black Sea strategy. So I'm really thankful to be here and discuss my thoughts when it comes to building resilience in regional states. So there's a couple things I'm gonna pretty much discuss that's important in terms of hitting each section that is expected in this panel. One is to definitely address the subversion and disinformation. So again, I come from government. I'm dual. Spent time with the State Department under the Biden-Harris administration and also Army reservist major, Iraq veteran. And so in terms of my perspective, I've had practitioner experiences as far as dealing with Russian disinformation. And by the way, I'll just put my disclaimer out there. My perspective does not reflect the United States government. So as far as disinformation goes, I just want to bring to your attention this wonderful report that was issued by the State Department from a sub-office called the GIC, the Global Engagement Center, where they highlighted Russia's tactics when it comes to disinformation. I think it's spot on in terms of highlighting the major tactics, and it makes you understand Russia's playbook. And they have five pillars that they've mentioned. One is that when it comes to disinformation, official government communications is definitely utilized by the Kremlin ministry through issuing major statements. So that's one. Also, two, state-funded global messaging, state-funded domestic-facing media is another that is pretty much utilized or a utilized tactic that Russia uses as well. Cultivation of proxy sources, Russian-aligned outlets with global reach using local languages. When I see that, I think of a lot of examples. I'm pretty sure everybody does too. One that comes in mind that I've first saw where Russia used like a local language to pretty much penetrate and influence the audience or the population is Catalonia independence movement in 2010 when Spain was pretty much facing an issue involving Catalonia that wanted to split off. So that's a good example. Weaponization of social media, that's one that I would say that everybody hears about and discusses a lot on TV, the infiltration of social media. Of course, that was a good example of that in the 2016, during the 2016 presidential elections. And then also we have cyber-enabled disinformation. Example of that is hacking. So again, these are all different tactics that the Global Engagement Center pretty much elaborates in its report, and it's worth reading about. What I like about the report too is the fact that it's applicable across, number one, and number two, it also brings up a recommendation that Katia mentioned, where it's very important that the State Department, along with other key stakeholders, work together to address this issue as a way to achieve resilience. Like, for instance, civil society, academia, the private sector. Everybody has to be on page because there's a sense of literacy behind this that we must achieve. The lack of awareness is, of course, something that helps Russia win at the end of the day. So media literacy, understand their playbook is very important. Now I'm going to go into the point of discussing Russia's weaponization of corruption, and then I'll talk about why democracy matters. I'm just going to touch on real quick as far as the weaponization of corruption involving the military. I think that's extremely relevant, especially what you see right now going on in Ukraine. Russia, of course, in terms of if you look right now at their policies, they have anti-corruption policies. They have a whole bunch of guidance out there saying that, yes, we are trying to combat corruption, but of course, it's a lack of accountability and discipline. And that definitely bleeds in terms of the implementation of the military or military operations, where it creates a lot of confusion in the battlefield. And our partners and allies can see that, and it's very hard to work with them when there's poor guidance coming from the top because of all the corruption, and also the lack of transparency helps lead to that. So in terms of corruption in the military, of course, learning from Clausewitz, he says that the military is a political tool. Well, it's very hard to utilize that tool if there's too much corruption behind it. For example, of course, we saw in Ukraine, many of those soldiers thought, Russian service members thought that they were implementing a peacekeeping mission, not, so again, there's a issue involving corruption, how the military is being deployed and utilized. So just looking at this overall as far as the disinformation, subversion, corruption, the big question here that we have to answer is, does democracy matter? Absolutely, democracy matters. Now that we're in the era of strategic competition, democracy definitely matters, and democracy must deliver and be result-driven and competitive. And if democracy does not achieve that, this will be a harder situation for democracies overall. Excuse me. So that's very important. And so when you think about democracies, you want to think about the existing institutions right now. Like, for instance, if you think about the United Nations, for example, they're pretty much, the United Nations is pretty much built up on democratic values, and they believe that no state should invade another state. But again, was there a level of deterrence where it deterred Russia from actually invading Ukraine? No, right? So, in another example too, when you think about the International Criminal Court, they had pretty much issued not too long ago an arrest warrant to Putin, right, against Putin, and saying that based on what you're doing is considered a war crime. But has that arrest happened? Where's the teeth behind this? So democratic institutions matter when it comes to here. The EU continues to deliver arms to Ukraine. That's great. Again, we have to see the results come out of these democratic institutions or democracies. So that's where I think where it matters overall, and we will see moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asha, and thanks for keeping on time. And we have time for Q&A session, and I'd like to start with my question first, then go to the how. So, Sergej brought up very important question. So for years, Putin probably learned one thing: he can achieve with some bribery and some corruption much more than he can achieve with military divisions. So he made certain achievements internally. He could bribe, I don't know, some strongman in one or another region, or some popular guy there. Or he can buy influence outside by, I don't know, getting Schroeder on the board of Gazprom, or some other guys that Sergej mentioned, the former officials. So my question is that what could be the, I don't know, institutional and legal frameworks? What are the institutional and legal frameworks that can be improved to, if not avoid, but to decrease the possibility? So Americans have national security screening for foreign direct investments. There are some licensing procedures. There are certain, I don't know, certain legal mechanisms how put barriers in front in the way of these corrupt practices. But still, it's a problem. It's a problem not only the emerging democracies, but it's a problem of well-established democracies, in well-established democracies as well. So what could be effective mechanisms to fight with it?
Well, thank you. That is a brilliant question. The bad and short answer is we have these mechanisms, but they don't work. Because of course, like in Germany, there are the mechanisms, the legal tools are here. Like not only they are being just ignored or they cannot be used properly. For example, the sanctions, as I mentioned, like there are EU sanctions, they just don't being implemented by the member state. Regarding screening, we have all these things. Like if a foreign company from outside of the EU buys more than like 25% of like a German company which has like strategic meaning, it need to be screened. It doesn't mean anything. Like the German federal police, at least German federal police, maybe other state-owned institutions, they used Kaspersky antivirus software for years. Well knowing that Kaspersky Labs has been founded by two FSB officers and that they actively cooperated with FSB. You actually like have, if you install Kaspersky on your computer, you not only welcome FSB in your kitchen, you have like a platoon of FSB officers drinking beer in your kitchen. And they knew that and they did it. If you look like on all these investments, there is just understanding, okay, like it cannot be bad. Like we know they're Russians, so what? I think it is also I think there are like two reasons for that. First, there is of course a consequence of long-year corruption. Like you know all the stories of installing Soviet spies, like starting from Guillaume in the office of Willy Brandt in 70s and. But and of course like they bring this idea that Russia is good, Russia is no problem. But also there is a false feeling of our strength. And economically, yes, Germany is much stronger than Russia. And NATO is militarily much stronger than Russia. There's no doubt in that. But that gives us, when I say us, like Germans, the feeling that we are totally safe. It can be nothing wrong. But it is a wrong feeling of safety. It is like I'm a human being. I'm a representative of sophisticated, world-dominating species. Like we really control the world. We can make with the world whatever we want. And when I see like a little small like tarantula or a snake, it's like, okay, what can you do to me? I can fly with a plane from here to Los Angeles. I can fly to the moon. What can you do to me? Oh, well, it can kill me very easily, despite of the fact that I'm sophisticated species that has knowledge of thousands of years. Now, the same is with Germany and Russia, I'm afraid. Like, we have a false feeling of safety.
Thank you. Anyone? Comment? All right. Questions from audience now. The one thing I just... Oh, Georgi. Oh, please do.
Can I ask? Can I ask a
sure.
question?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have
That's
to
fine.
put my glasses on.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for your empirical insights. I have a question here. I was listening carefully to the speakers, and I was wondering, what's your explanation that the German foreign policymakers have this kind of mindset? We have witnessed in 2008 that before the war in Georgia, that we were also denied the membership action plan for NATO integration, not only Georgia but also Ukraine. And the official explanation was that, you were not ready in terms of democratic development. And as we know, NATO has a lower threshold compared to EU in that regard. And perhaps that was that political leaders, Georgian political leaders, and perhaps Ukrainian political leaders too, did not have this balanced or more closer relationships in terms of credible relations with German policymakers. Although Germany has this experience of, that Soviet Union occupation and this political memories and the post-World War construction of security in which the Americans helped a lot. And if Germany now is the one of the leading European state, is also Americans contributed a lot to this process. So I was really wondering to explain myself too as a political scientist and scholar what the rationale behind such decisions, because Russia is not only the enemy for Georgia or Ukraine or the Black Sea countries, but also for it challenges European security and international liberal order. So I was wondering your explanation from both sides, American side and from German side. I guess you have experience living there and knowing and meeting this kind of people who are decision makers. What are their true rationale? So is it all about political corruption? Is this because of the political memory and they are afraid of this political memory because they are just trying to do all things and the direct confrontation is the last resort in these relations, or something else also? Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's, anyone would like to pick on this? Yeah, please.
I don't want to hijack the discussion, but you're pushing me into Germany bashing. I'm allowed with my German passport. There are a lot of reasons for what you named, a lot of them. And some of them are of that corruption level, some of them are of like self-perception level of Germany. Like a lot of German elites. I will start with the second, because the first we have addressed them already. There's corruption. Like Russia gives a feeling of being bigger than you are. You can earn your money in Russia on the ways which are not more money, but on the ways which are not allowed in Germany. And for some people, they are more pleasant than those which are allowed in Germany. But regarding these moral aspects, first, for many of German elites, this Russophilia is a way to express their anti-Americanism and their denial of transatlantic connections. Because when you are in a transatlantic union, you stick to the rules. And these rules are not always pleasant. when you stick to Russia, then you have this understanding, okay, they are also bullies. Like, we are the former bullies. We know how it is to be a bully. And when you see an active bully, we can see in this bully the ways we would gladly go, but we are not allowed now to. So we understand it's like body, it's like bromance. So it is a hierarchical society. It is a society where you have elites and where you have subordinates. It is a society which divides the nations into those who are allowed to speak and who are not. When you spoke for years to Berlin politicians, even to the good ones, even those who used to be pro-Ukrainian, you always heard this sentence like, Russia is our neighbor. We need to maintain good relations to Russia because Russia is our neighbor. No, look at the geographic map. Russia is not your neighbor. You don't have a border to Russia since 1939. Like, your neighbor is Poland, your neighbor is like Czechia, your neighbor is Austria, but not Russia. And Russia is so important because Russia is our economic partner, important economic partner. No, look at the statistics. German trade with Russia was 3 times lower than German trade with Poland. And Poland is your neighbor. And if you count it like per capita, trade with Poland was 10 times bigger than trade with Russia. Of course, for certain industries and for certain companies, Russia was very important. Gas companies, like some companies which sell certain goods. But for German GDP, it was less than 2%. Like, if Russia would have disappeared tomorrow, it would have had less impact to German economy than COVID pandemic on GDP level. So that was this false perception. We understand them, we feel good with them, we understand how they do, and we want to talk to them over the heads of the Central European nations. And that was, I'm afraid I'm not an expert in Georgian things, but I think that it could be the same motive. Like, it was always the talk to Russia about the Ukrainians, because we may not have our Ukrainian relations, Ukrainian policy, without taking into considerations what the Russians would say. So for any our step towards Ukraine, Germany needed a de facto permission of Russia, which Russia would never allow itself to do in their policy towards Ukraine. They would never ask, what should we do to Ukraine? What would Germans say about that? But the Germans always say, okay, we cannot do this with Kyiv because it will ergo Russia, exactly with the NATO accession and economic connection, etc. So to wrap it up, it is a many years delusion by special relations to Russia. It is definitely overestimating of the Russia's role in history, economic, politics, etc. It is fascination by imaginary Russian power, and it is some sort of projection of internal now I'm on a tricky, swampy terrain of this political Freudism, projection of own sweet dreams, what I would have done, but I'm not allowed, and this is the guy who may do it, so I better stick to him, so I enjoy it from second-hand shop. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to add more geopolitical perspective. I think first thing we have to distinguish between NATO membership and EU membership. I think the reason why, unlike Ukraine and Moldova, Georgia did not receive the candidate status was the very unfortunate democratic reversal that we have seen in this country, very sadly, over the past 10 years. I don't think it's out of question as soon as Georgia improves. I think Georgia will also receive this candidate status. If we talk about NATO, I think the situation is completely different. Obviously, for everyone now, Ukraine is on the agenda first. The second point is that, like Ukraine, Georgia is partly occupied, so NATO has not yet figured out how to deal with the country, how to offer the so-called action plan to a country which whose government doesn't fully control its territory. What I'm hearing, unofficially, it seems that more and more Western capitals agreeing to still offer to Ukraine this action membership plan or scrap it altogether, but offer this membership perspective. It won't happen at the Vilnius summit in a couple of weeks' time, but hopefully it will develop towards that option in the coming months. And I think once the situation with Ukraine is solved, once NATO is closer to offering action plan or roadmap to Ukraine, I think it will have a domino effect for Georgia, and Georgia won't have long to wait. But I think we have to, again, coming back to what I said at the beginning, we have to separate. There is very clear acquis communautaire for the European Union membership, and in order for us to receive the candidate status, there should be some reforms that should be implemented. With NATO, I think it's completely different and sadly dependent on the military occupation, but yeah, hopefully will be resolved in the coming months, years, 1-2 years, I don't know, I mean, I won't speculate.
Thank you. And I think partially yesterday there was, during the discussion, one of our distinguished speakers also brought up this issue and compared the case of Germany when they joined NATO. The 1/3 of Germany was occupied by Soviet troops. So therefore, we discussed it also partially yesterday. Georgi, and then the gentleman behind, and yeah. Maybe we can collect like 3 questions and then answer them together. Yes, please.
Thank you, David. My name is Georgi Kandelaki. Quick point on NATO. Georgia has de facto abandoned the priority of NATO accession. The Prime Minister has recently blamed NATO for the start of the war in Ukraine. I think it's important to keep that in mind. But my question is on another matter, and that has to do with since the topic of this panel is disinformation, it has to do with memory. What about memory and the weaponization of memory? You mentioned a lot of sort of tactical weapons, if you will, in the information domain, but isn't the weaponization of memory, so to speak, a strategic weapon, overarching sort of umbrella that brings everything together? Isn't memory the reason for which Russia started this war in the first place? And I'm asking this because there has been a lot of criticism for the limited scale of Western sort of counter-disinformation efforts, the European Union, US, UK. But in this Western counter-disinformation agenda, what about the importance of memory? And I'm asking this because in Georgia, to bring ourselves back to where we are today, in Georgia, Russians have been very successful at weaponizing Soviet memory, and this has unfolded largely under the Western radars and the Western efforts in which memory is not featured at all. The Western modus operandi in Georgia of counter-disinformation efforts is mostly sort of analytical, producing fact-checking, newsletters, things that don't really impact public opinion, whereas our adversary is very successful at that. And a great example of this success, and I'll end there, is the resurgence of the image of Stalin in Georgia. 11 new statues, 46% of Georgians think that patriotic Georgians should be proud of Stalin. 40% think that Stalin was a secret Christian. 38% say that they heard mostly or only good things about Stalin at school. And Russians view this as Frankfurter Allgemeine called it, a propaganda gateway. If you as a Georgian believe you can't be proud of Stalin, even a bit, are you more likely or less to be vulnerable to other sort of more tactical narratives? Thank you.
Thank you, Georgi. Weaponizing fake memory, it would be better to say. Yeah, the gentleman behind, and Lee then, and then.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Nina over here, Otto, Katia, thank you very much for your remarks on resilience. And just to follow up on the question that Georgi was just asked about the Russian disinformation, my question refers to the resilience, and you spoke about the role of the society and saying that the civil society drives change for development and civil society can see better and pinpoint gaps to the government on special task force. My question would be, what's your opinion about, let's say, ongoing threats or open attacks or, let's say, attempts of discrimination towards the people, experts, even towards some of the panelists over here who speak loudly against Russian disinformation or counter-Russian propaganda, for example? And on your way to the EU integration or membership, have you faced, let's say, a civil confrontation of some kind, and how have you handled it? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Luca Citiani. I would like to follow up on the comment of Mr. Otto and question of Mr. Kandelaki. The reason they are saying that Stalin was secretly Christian is because the church and the religion is quite important institution and important tool in Georgia. And for example, we see attacks on politicians and political activists based on the fact that they are criticizing this institution. So considering such massive influence this institution and this kind of factor has on the Georgian society, what would you, all of the panelists, would suggest can be done against such massive and deeply imbued thing such as religion? Thank you.
Thank you. If you look on the Russian church, that you understand that church and religion are two different things there. And Lee, please.
Thank you. By some estimates, some 60 to 80% of the Russian population support the special military operation. So my question is with respect to disinformation within Russia itself, is what can we do to counter disinformation within the Russian society? Because until there's more transparency and truth across that society, it's unlikely that there would be any sort of regime change in Russia, and obviously that has impacts for all the aggression we're seeing in the Black Sea region, the Baltics, etc. So internal disinformation is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Very important question.
Thank you.
Katia and
Those are most interesting questions. I'll try to share my thoughts on several of them. First of all, I would like to start with the weaponization of memory or of false memory. I think if we would look at the Baltic states, then certainly it is one of the best cases where you could observe that. Because we look at the way how different aspects of history have been used to question, for example, the state continuity of the democratic republics in the Baltic region. It is also the question of the interpretation of some aspects of World War II, as well as the whitewashing of Soviet war crimes in the occupied territories, and as well as the following Soviet colonization. And we see that, it was also something that was important for the Russian government throughout our relationships since we regained our independence. This also goes to such examples as the cyber attacks that I mentioned, that, for example, one of the first biggest examples was in 2007 when it was that after the removal of, rather than changing the location of the positioning of one Soviet monument in Estonia, the response of Russia was to cyber attack and try to paralyze the electronic public services. That, of course, was, this way how to try to prevent the governments in my region in trying to do anything about it. What we have also seen is the heavy usage of social media to question the narratives that are either part of what is included in the constitution, such as the state continuity, or with regard to different holidays or days of commemoration, which is, I think, with the objective of questioning the trust of people in the state, in the government, in the democratic values, and perhaps to show that, you know, what we are having right now, the democratic countries, the democratic government is not really within those values that we should respect, because that is what our history ought to be. I think that the same goes with this concept of the post-Soviet, and I think Katia shaped that very well in her opening statement, how sometimes controversial this is, because on the one hand, certainly academically we could use the term, but I think one other aspect that we would have to recognize is how this term is also used in trying to strike out the memory of the fact that, for example, the republics of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were established in 1918, and we were not, let's say, an imperialist creation of the 1990s as a way for the Americans to support Great Russia. So it was rather than the will of our people and the war of independence that we fought because we wanted independent democratic republics, and Russia and the Soviet Union tried to prevent it in many ways. To give a few comments on the other questions. With regard to the resilience of civil society, I think a very strong role is for the non-governmental organizations. If we would compare, for example, the situation of the Baltic states and Poland to that of, for example, Belarus, I think it shows a very important role of activities and organization of the civic society, which is not reliant on the state. And one of the reasons why, for example, Latvia did not become another Belarus in terms of governance was that our society had, on the one hand, the democratic memory, the democratic experience, but also it was ready to organize, and it did not wait for the government, or even at the time of the independence movement, there were several factions in it, because it was not that, you know, we will have this one organization and we will wait, we will look at their mouths and we'll wait for what they are saying. It is about the society of being able to organize themselves without the help of the government, and that's very important for the resilience of civic society. With regard to the church, I would like to bring up the example of what the Latvian government did, which was that, for example, in the case of Latvia, of course, we have the separation of the church and the state. At the same time, we have a legal oversight from the side of the government. What they did in trying to limit the influence of Russia in the case of the Latvian Orthodox Church, because I think that it was not announced openly, but I think that the Latvian Orthodox Church, I think, asked the government to do that, was that they changed the law that regulates on who are the officials of the church by requiring a 10-year residency requirement, meaning that it cannot be the case that, for example, the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow, under which the Latvian Orthodox Church is officially subordinate, would, let's say, send and switch the key officials of the church. So for you to be an official in the Latvian Orthodox Church, you have to have lived in Latvia for at least 10 years. And that was the change that the government brought to avoid this case that, you know, as at the time of the occupation in 1940, they just sent in a number of Russian Latvians, a number of communists from Russia to make up the puppet government of Soviet Latvia, which was a tool what they used to show that this accession to the Soviet Union must be legitimate because we have this sort of democratic process. But of course, it was all fakery. Thank you.
Thank you. I would start with the question regarding the disinformation in Russian society. I think it's extremely hard to do this, extremely hard. Like the Russians, it is not that the Russians didn't have access to information all the time. They had it. like the Russian-speaking services, and not only in foreign languages, Russian-speaking services of BBC, of Deutsche Welle, of Radio Liberty, and even the Russian independent media. Like, I can criticize them for like imperialistic narrative. I do it often, but they still provided Russians with information about like many aspects of criminal character of the Putin's regime. And it didn't mean that the Russians didn't have access to information regarding the truth or alternative opinions on what Putin is doing. They have filtered it out. And Putin has clearly touched the nerve of the Russians, and he gave them what many of them wanted to see, this prioritization of violence, of military violence against the neighbors, this glorification of the military history in the sense of warmongering of the worst shape, etc. I don't think we can counter this development now with counter propaganda or like with some educative measures. I think first the facts should be shapen on the battlefield. And exactly as you cannot be successful in your PSYOPs against an enemy unit, as long as this enemy unit is being beaten into readiness to accept your message, and then you can be successful. Exactly that way we cannot now spread the word in Russia, because even those people from Russia who left Russia because they didn't want to be mobilized, many of them still, if you make deep interviews, you will see that they are not that against the Russian narrative. They still think that the West have discriminated the Russians, that there is like Russophobia, etc. So actually they repeat Putin's propaganda, which forced them effectively to leave the country, because otherwise they would have perished somewhere close to Bakhmut. So this is extremely complicated. Regarding the weaponizing of memory, it is a huge story in many countries. In Germany, it is especially problematic because, and for right, a huge part of our post-war identity is being built on the acceptance of truth that Germany was extremely criminal regime during the World War II, and we are responsible for the worst crimes that have been committed in the history of Europe. And that idea that we need to bring responsibility and we need to respect the fact that we have been liberated from that terrorist regime of the Nazis, and we have given a chance to live in a democratic society. It is a part of our identity, and the Russians knew how to weaponize it. So they have privatized the whole memory of the Soviet Union. First, they have erased the fact that the Soviet Union was an ally of Nazi Germany in 1939 until 1941. Then they have presented themselves as the only liberators of Europe. I don't mean like only liberators, with excluding the Americans or Brits, but from all the Soviet nations. That is why when German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, who thank God changed her mind after that, but when she came to Kiev 3 weeks before the Russian full-scale invasion, she was asked if Germany would deliver weapons to Ukraine, lethal weapons, and she said no, because of our history. And the answer meant like, no, we cannot send weapons which would kill Russians because we have responsibility towards the Russians, but she completely excluded responsibility towards Ukrainians. The same when like on 10th of February, like 2 weeks before the Russian full-scale invasion, German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier is being asked by the newspaper Rheinische Post about Nord Stream 2. And he said, we may not cancel Nord Stream 2 because it's our way to pay the debt to Russia for the crimes we have committed against Russia. Once again, he excluded the German responsibility towards Ukraine or Poland, as if there were no Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, as if there were no Warsaw Uprising, as if there were no Babin Yar, as if. And now, like now I wrap up. When we look at how Russians weaponized it, how Russians brought these night wolves to Berlin every year, how Russians weaponized the German, Russian-speaking community with all the Soviet flags and Russian memorials, etc. Now it is not that easy for them. There are limitations for using Soviet flags, etc. on the memorials, but still, we still have Soviet war memorials in Germany. And that is now it is really a legal case because we have a law in Germany which protects these memorials. And this law is based on a treaty of 1992, if I'm not mistaken, between Federal Republic of Germany and Russian Federation. And this law protects all the memorials, the Soviet memorials, because they are military graves. And that is interesting how in 1992, Russian Federation spoke without any right to do so, spoke in the name of all the nations of the Soviet Union who were in 1992 already independent countries. So the Russian Federation de facto took the right, and Federal Republic of Germany accepted it, took the right to speak about what will be with the graves of the Ukrainians, of Lithuanians, of Tajiks, of other independent nations. And they have claimed these memorials for themselves. They forced Germany, like not forced by force, but by this obligation, this moral obligation, to signing of this treaty. And now we have in Berlin, the Treptow Park, the biggest one, if you have been there, it is an endless field with huge stones, with quotes of Joseph Stalin engraved in every of these things. There are not even names of the soldiers, but there are quotations, quotes of Joseph Stalin. And Russia guaranteed by this treaty between Germany and Russia that Germany may not change anything. And I think that is a problem that should be addressed in the next years, exactly as you did it in Riga.
Great. I'll be quick. As far as the weaponization of memory, I know I'm not sure if this will probably provide a lot of teeth here, but constantly condemning that Russia has weaponized use of memory is critical. And also, sanctions are, effective, although criticized of being slow as far as delivering results, but it does deliver results. And in fact, with regards to this issue, after condemning it, definitely matched up as far as the holding them accountable, definitely aligned it with multilateral sanctions as far as addressing the issue. Like for instance, the Kremlin-affiliated Russian tech giant Yandex claimed that the international sanctions recently against Russia prevented the company from providing the Russian Federal Security Service, FSB, with user data in compliance with Russian security law, resulting in a significant fine. So this was actually, in some ways, effective. So I would look at that as an approach as far as addressing weaponization of memory. Going back to the question of protesting, young lady, yes. First of all, thank you for standing up and believing what you believe in. As an American, I admire that. What I would do if I was you is definitely think about how you could build up your external support as a way to build up your external pressure as far as those that are trying to minimize your voice or not be able to, allow you to speak up. External pressure works. So I would definitely try to identify those outside of your domain or your area to help you as far as addressing that issue. A perfect example of that we saw was Iran recently, where there was a lot of international or external pressure pressuring Iran to addressing the issue involving women there. So definitely keep going and find the external support. And as far as the other question in terms of Russian counter disinformation, how do you effectively address that? One piece I would definitely look into is looking into the Russian diaspora, those that are aligned with believing that that Russian disinformation is a destabilizer, and those that live outside of Russia, and be able to work closely with them so that they can outreach to Russians with internally as far as addressing the disinformation issues. So, and working very closely with the civil society as far as addressing that. So the Russian diaspora, I think, is critical to this. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I will also try to be brief. As far as the question of the lady is concerned, how to fight attacks on yourself and whether we do have such attacks, I think, yes, well, absolutely. Well, first of all, I think one very practical tool is to check your sources really well whenever you write something. And I can give you many examples thinking about what has been happening, for example, in London with British think tanks. I heard that recently one of the think tanks, for one of the reports that they wrote about exactly that, about how London has been laundering the money of oligarchs and how it has been complacent in the Russian narrative, was the think tank was attacked and almost brought to court. And when they started checking their sources, it turned out that some of those sources were not checked correctly. So one thing is check your sources, protect yourself. And yes, that, as I said, that happens all the time. I know researchers who were approached, through, we all know them through social media, hate speech, etc. Again, you just build your own resilience in that. I would like to mention, and this relates both to countering Russian internal disinformation and to memory, one important point that I think we in the West have also been very much complacent in supporting, maybe not deliberately, the Russian narrative of its, big empire. And this is something that what we are trying to, in the West now, to deal with, particularly Ukrainian civil society actors are very active in that, in trying to decolonize this narrative. I'm talking about looking at the history through the Russian Soviet prism, looking at, museums, when Ukrainian, Georgian artists, writers, etc., they are called Russian. And now, there is, fortunately, finally, there is debate about that in the West, in think tanks, in the academia, about how we can tackle this problem. Because that also relates to the Russian propaganda narrative. And I think a lot of the public opinion also stems not just from the Russian propaganda, but what they believe in, how they were taught history. And perhaps one more point to mention about countering disinformation. Obviously, as Sergej said, it's very difficult inside Russia because we can't reach out so easily now. And also the resources that the Russian state puts into its own media production are enormous, and it's very hard to match that. And when so I would recommend, obviously, supporting financially for donors who can do that, support production of high quality news content to replace Russian propaganda. BBC has been doing, Russian service has been doing a great job. It would be great to have more like BBC, Deutsche Welle, Voice of America, similar services, but also support independent media. And I would very much be in line with what Asha has been saying about the Russian diaspora. So far in the European Union, in the UK, there is now no policy towards Russia, and no one actually wants to talk to Russian diaspora because, they sort of, to put it bluntly, the belief is that there are no good Russians. So all the policy now should be targeting Ukraine. But again, I think that, if we are talking about the creation of new content, it will probably come from Russian civil society who are in exile, and Russian media, they have moved out, and will take some time, I think, for different mechanisms for them to establish themselves. And I can just, only compare the situation with Belarus, for example, when independent media have been moving out of Belarus since 2020, and they have also a history of Western support. I think something like that will come to Russia, but currently you can see how much the independent media in Belarus, being outside of Belarus, is able to do. And we don't see this in Russia. Just one example, in Belarus on Telegram channels, you can, find and read 5, 6 independent media channels, whereas with Russia, I think the main one, daily news, would be just Meduza. You'll get, Moscow Times, Novaya Gazeta, but they are not really, daily news media. They're more like analytical services. So helping Russian independent media to have a footprint in Russia, I think, would be also good.
Yes, I promise. Just a small remark regarding the question of threats, etc. I personally got several legal threats. It's very German way. You're not being threatened to be killed or beaten. You're threatened with a lawsuit that you will be put into jail for smearing. In Germany, we have a pretty complicated criminal code. And there is an article smearing if you spread something or some information, some statement which can be identified as false and destroying someone's image, then you can be sued with smearing, and it's a criminal offense. I think up to 3 years in jail. And I got these threats, when I criticized people for spreading Russian propaganda, I immediately got a nice letter from an attorney office that they offer me either I sign a declaration that I reject to ever publicly mention this person, or I pay 10,000 euro for every mentioning of them, or I go to jail. And I had to use my lawyers to fight this back. I know that the German scientist Franziska Davis, a very distinguished scholar from Munich, she got a real legal process, criminal process against her. She won it in the second instance, but it costed her tens of thousands of euro. She had to fundraise her costs because she didn't have legal insurance. And this is exactly what the Russians are doing in Germany. Yes, they try to silence you by exploiting the German legal system, and they have resources for law companies. And if you don't have legal insurance, you can be financially ruined. Yes.
Thank you very much. We are really behind the schedule, but I hope I won't be punished, and this is compensated by the quality of our discussions and our speakers. Please join me thanking our excellent speakers.